The paper is damp before I even unfold it. Soft at the creases the way newsprint goes when it's been carried in someone's pocket through humidity, it was never built to survive. And Quan holds it out to me through the bars with 2 fingers, the way you'd hand someone something you didn't want to touch any longer than necessary. I don't take it right away. I have learned, by the 4th month of this, that anything offered without being demanded is usually worse than anything taken by force. And Quan's face, when I finally do reach for it, has the particular flat patience of a man who already knows exactly what I'm about to see and has been looking forward to watching me see it. The clipping is small, 3 columns wide, torn rather than cut from whatever paper it came from. And even before my eyes adjust to actual words in the bad light of the cell, I recognize the shape of a wedding photograph. The particular triangle 2 people make standing close together in their good clothes, a church visible behind them, white columns, a date printed below it that I make myself read twice because the first time I don't trust that I've read it correctly. The second time I trust it. The bride is wearing her hair the way she wore it the morning I left, pinned back from her face with the part on the wrong side for a photograph, which is a detail nobody else would notice and which I notice immediately, because I have spent 4 months in a 6x8 cell with very little to occupy my attention besides every detail I have ever known about Margaret Halloran, including which side she parts her hair on. The groom is not me. Quan says something in English good enough to have clearly been rehearsed for this exact moment. Something about how generous it is that I'm being given the chance to know, how other men in other camps have waited years for news that never comes, how I should consider myself fortunate. I do not say anything. I fold the clipping back along its original creases, hand it through the bars without being asked to, and sit down on the concrete with my back against the wall, and I do not let my face do anything at all, because the one thing I have left that is entirely mine in this place is the right to decide what they get to see. To explain how a man ends up reading his own wife's wedding announcement through a set of iron bars in a country 8,000 miles from the one where he married her, you have to go back to Pensacola in the spring of 1964, to a Naval Air Station Officers Club dance where I was a 23-year-old flight student trying to work up the nerve to ask a girl named Margaret Halloran for a second dance after the first one had gone badly enough that I'd stepped on her foot twice. She said yes anyway, both times, the second dance, and 18 months later, the question I asked her on a pier in Pensacola with the Gulf going dark behind us. And we were married in June of 1966 in her parents' backyard in Mobile under a tent that nearly blew over twice during the ceremony from a storm that never quite arrived. Her father giving a toast he'd clearly rewritten 3 times because he kept losing his place in it and starting over, which made the whole tent laugh harder than the toast itself ever could have. I want to say we went into it with our eyes open about what a career flying fighters for the Air Force was going to cost a marriage. But the truth is at 25 I believed I was the kind of pilot bad things happened to other men around, and Margaret believed whatever I believed, because that's what a new wife does in the first years, before life has taught her otherwise. I can list the specific cost of that belief now, in the particular currency of days, the way another man might count medals. I was at Nellis for an 11-week training rotation in the fall of 1966 when Margaret's father had his first stroke, and by the time I got emergency leave approved and flew commercial back to Mobile, I arrived at the hospital 2 days after he'd already been moved out of intensive care, in time to see him sitting up joking weakly with his brothers, having already survived the worst of it without me anywhere near the room. I was on alert status at a base in the Philippines in March of 1967, 6 hours from any phone that worked reliably, when Margaret had a miscarriage in our 7th month of trying, alone in our apartment outside Pensacola, and drove herself to the base hospital because it was 2 in the morning and she didn't want to wake the wife next door over something she told me later she was certain, in the moment, she could handle by herself. I was flying training sorties out of Eglin in June of 1967 when Margaret's college roommate got married in Atlanta, a wedding Margaret had been planning to stand up and since the 2 of them were 19, and a scheduling conflict that could have gone either way went the way it always seemed to go. And she sat in a pew instead of beside the altar and told me on the phone afterward that it was fine. The dress wouldn't have fit right anyway, with a lightness in her voice I had already learned by then not to take entirely at face value. I missed our first wedding anniversary by 4 days in June of 1967, training continuing past the date everyone had told me it would end, and Margaret put a single candle in a cupcake and ate it alone at our kitchen table, a detail I only know because she told me, much later, in a letter that arrived in this very camp, that she'd kept the candle afterward in a kitchen drawer for reasons she couldn't fully explain even to herself. And in November of that same year, I was on a 2-week gunnery detachment to a range in Arizona when Margaret's mother needed emergency gallbladder surgery, and Margaret sat alone in a waiting room in Mobile for 6 hours with nobody beside her but a cousin she hadn't seen since childhood, and called me that night to say everything had gone fine, in a voice pitched carefully enough toward calm that I didn't learn until years afterward how frightened she'd actually been sitting there. And I left for Vietnam in February of 1968, 6 weeks after Margaret told me she was pregnant again, the second time since the miscarriage, with a due date that fell squarely in the middle of what was supposed to be a 1-year combat tour, which meant I had already done the arithmetic, standing in our kitchen with my orders in hand, on exactly how much of that pregnancy I was going to miss and exactly how little control either of us had over the number. None of it, at the time, felt like a series of choices being made. It felt like the war, the way the tide feels like the tide, a force that ran on its own clock regardless of what either of us would have preferred, and we both called it that for years, the cost of the job, the price of the uniform, and left it mostly there, unexamined, the way you leave alone a thing you don't yet know how to look at directly. The morning I left for Vietnam, Margaret drove me to the base herself rather than letting one of the other wives do it. And at the gate, she didn't cry the way some of the other wives standing along that same stretch of fence were crying. She just held on to my flight suit at the collar for a long moment, the fabric bunched in both fists, and said, "You come back," not as a question and not quite as an order either. Something closer to a fact she was stating into existence by saying it out loud. I told her I would. I believed it the way every pilot believes it walking onto a flight line, which is to say completely, and also not at all, in the particular way a man holds two contradictory certainties at once when the alternative is not being able to do the job. My weapons systems officer in the backseat of the Phantom was a lieutenant named Pete Lindqvist, 26 years old, recently engaged to a girl in Minnesota. He talked about with an earnestness that made the rest of the squadron tease him without mercy. And on the 11th of June, 1968, for months into the tour, we took a surface-to-air missile on a strike run 12 miles north of the demilitarized zone, and I remember the cockpit filling with a white light before the actual sound of it arrived, the way lightning beats its own thunder, and I remember Pete's voice on the intercom, very calm, saying we're hit, and then nothing else from him at all. I ejected at an altitude and a speed that I would later be told, in the camp, by a doctor I didn't trust, should have broken both my legs and didn't, which I have never decided whether to call luck. I landed in a rice paddy with a dislocated shoulder and a torn open assumption about my own invulnerability, and I was taken within 20 minutes by men who had clearly been watching the parachute the whole way down. I did not see Pete's parachute. I have never, to this day, learned with any certainty whether he ejected at all, and the not knowing has occupied a particular room in me for over 50 years that I have never been able to fully close the door on. The walk to the first holding point took 6 hours through terrain I couldn't see clearly through the swelling already starting around one eye. And somewhere in that walk, a young soldier guarding me, no older than 19, offered me a cigarette in a gesture so unexpectedly human that I took it before I decided whether taking it was a kind of surrender, and we walked the rest of the way in a silence that had, briefly, almost nothing to do with war in it at all, the cigarette smoke mixing with the wet green smell of the paddy. Still clinging to my flight suit, the only 2 cents I would carry, oddly paired, for the rest of my life whenever either one showed up alone. I had to step into a kind of distance from my own body to keep walking that last hour, the shoulder no longer registering as pain so much as a fact happening somewhere nearby. And I remember looking up once, between trees, at a sky exactly the same pale color it had been that morning over the carrier, and thinking, with a clarity I have never quite recovered, that Margaret didn't yet know any of this had happened, that somewhere on the other side of the world she was still living in a version of that morning where I was simply on a mission, due back by dinner, the way I always had been before. What I understood, sitting against that concrete wall with Quan's footsteps fading down the corridor, had nothing at all to do, at first, with whether the clipping was real. I never doubted it was real. What I understood, working it through with the slow, patient arithmetic a man develops when arithmetic is nearly the only thing left to occupy him, was the date. My name had appeared on a list of known American prisoners released by the North Vietnamese to the international press 11 months earlier, a list the Red Cross had confirmed and the Defense Department had used to formally notify the families of every name on it that their husbands and sons were alive and held, not missing, not presumed dead, but specifically, officially, alive. The wedding in the clipping was dated 7 months after that list went public. which meant this was not a widow's grief making a quiet peace with an uncertain future. This was Margaret, knowing with the same certainty the United States government had given her in writing, that I was alive in a camp somewhere in North Vietnam, standing in front of a minister and saying vows to another man anyway. I sat with that fact for a long time without moving, the concrete cold enough through my shirt that I eventually stopped noticing it, the way you stop noticing most things in that place that aren't actively trying to hurt you. I did not cry. I want to be honest that the absence of tears wasn't strength, exactly. It was closer to a kind of internal seizing up, a system overloading past the point where it knows how to register anything at all. And what came out instead, sometime well after dark, sitting alone in a cell with no light to read by even if I'd had the clipping back in my hands, was a single dry, humorless laugh that surprised me more than anything Quan had shown me that afternoon, because some part of me, even then, understood the particular cruelty of being right. What I mean by being right is this. From the morning I left for flight training in Pensacola, some private, unexamined corner of me had never fully believed I deserved a woman like Margaret Halloran, who could have married any number of steadier men with steadier jobs and a calendar that didn't run on the Air Force's clock, and who chose instead, for reasons I never stopped being grateful for and never stopped quietly doubting, to marry a fighter pilot. I performed every single day of our marriage right up until the morning at that gate, the absolute confidence of a man who believed completely in his own return, because that performance was the job, both the official one and the unofficial one a husband owes a frightened wife. Privately, in the particular hours before a mission when a man's thoughts go places he doesn't share with anyone, I had spent 2 years quietly rehearsing the version of events where I didn't come back, and in every single rehearsal, the part that hurt worse than my own death was imagining Margaret eventually, mercifully, finding someone else. Someone who could give her the ordinary, unremarkable life I had always half suspected I was too selfish, too in love with the particular violence of flying, to actually give her myself. I had told myself, in those private rehearsals, that I would want that for her. I had never once tested whether I meant it, because the test had always remained safely theoretical, a thing I imagined rather than a thing that happened to me on a concrete floor with a wedding clipping fresh in my memory. Now it had stopped being theoretical, and I discovered, sitting in the dark, that the man who had spent 2 years generously imagining Margaret's future happiness without him had been, it turned out, a much braver and more honest man than the one currently sitting on this floor, because that man had never had to actually survive watching the thing he claimed to want for her arrive on schedule 7 months after she'd been told, in writing, that he wasn't dead at all. I had spent 2 years telling myself the generous thing and the honest thing were the same thing, and sitting on that floor I understood, for the first time, that they might never have been the same thing at all, that generosity offered from a safe theoretical distance and generosity demanded of you, without warning on a concrete floor, are two entirely different currencies, and I had only ever actually paid in the first one. It took nearly 2 years more, deep into the second winter of captivity, before I came close to saying any of this out loud, to a man in the cell beside mine named Hutch Calloway, an Army major we communicated with through a tap code against the shared wall, a slow, laborious alphabet that turned every actual conversation into something closer to a vigil. Hutch had been there longer than I had 2 daughters back in Texas he hadn't seen since they were toddlers, and one night, tapping out the long patient code letter by letter, he told me his own wife had stopped writing entirely 8 months earlier. No explanation, just silence where there used to be letters, and that he'd convinced himself she must have died, some accident, something merciful, because the alternative explanation was one he didn't have room in that cell to survive thinking about. I had the clipping memorized by then, every word of the caption, the date, the side she'd parted her hair on, and some part of me, tapping back through that wall, came right up to the edge of telling him, of saying through that code, I know exactly what you're afraid of, because it already happened to me, because some company in that admission might have been worth the cost of saying it. I tapped out instead a string of nonsense about the weather, about a guard who'd been replaced that week, about nothing, and Hutch tapped back something equally beside the point. And we let the actual subject sit there on the other side of a wall neither of us crossed, 2 men keeping each other alive through code, while keeping the worst of what we each knew entirely to ourselves. Because somewhere in that camp we had both learned the same lesson, that there is a particular kind of mercy in not handing another suffering man the full weight of your own. I came home in the fall of 1970, part of an early release group sent out for reasons that were explained to us in terms I never fully trusted, paraded briefly for cameras in a country eager for any image of a returning serviceman that didn't involve a casket. Margaret was not at the airbase when the bus carrying us pulled in past the chain-link fence. I want to say I wasn't expecting her, and in the part of me that had done the arithmetic on that clipping 100 times over 2 years, I genuinely wasn't. But I scanned the crowd anyway, the way a man scans a crowd for one specific face out of pure animal habit, even when his mind has already settled the question. And somewhere near the back, behind 2 rows of families holding handmade signs, I found her. She was alone. No husband beside her, no child visible from that distance, just Margaret, in a blue coat I didn't recognize, standing very still while everyone around her waved and called out names. Our eyes met across maybe 40 yards of tarmac and held there for 3 or 4 seconds, which is a long time to hold a look across that kind of distance with that much history sitting inside it. And neither of us moved toward the other, and neither of us looked away first either, until a public affairs officer's hand on my shoulder turned me toward a different direction entirely, toward a podium and a microphone and a colonel saying words I don't remember a single one of, and when I looked back toward where she'd been standing, she was gone. I might have let that be the whole of it, the look across the tarmac standing in for everything that didn't get said, except that 3 weeks later, staying in a guest room at my sister's house in Birmingham, while I worked out what came next, I found, in a box of my own old letters that Margaret had apparently mailed to my sister for safekeeping sometime during the 2nd year of my captivity, a separate bundle tucked at the very bottom, a year's worth of letters from Margaret to me that had never reached the camp at all, returned undelivered, the censors apparently having decided at some point that the volume coming through was more than they were willing to process. There were 41 of them, dated weekly almost without fail from the week after my capture through the week the official POW list went public, and reading them in my sister's guest room with the door closed, I learned that Margaret had spent that entire first year fighting, writing senators, calling the Pentagon's casualty office, so often one letter mentions a clerk there recognizing her voice, refusing every gentle suggestion from well-meaning relatives that she start preparing herself for. The worst, that she owed it to herself and eventually to whatever child she was raising to consider that I might not come home at all. The letters got harder to read the further into that year they went. Not because the hope in them faded, but because of how much it cost her to keep insisting on it against advice that kept arriving from every direction telling her she was being unrealistic. The last letter in the bundle, dated 4 days before the official list went public, said simply, "I don't know how much longer I can keep telling people I know you're alive when I don't actually know anything at all. I just refuse to stop saying it." I sat with that bundle of letters for a long time, the same way I'd sat with the clipping 2 years earlier. And I understood that whatever decision came after the list went public had not been made by a woman who'd given up easily, or quickly, or without a fight that had nearly cost her everything else in her life to wage. It complicated the wedding clipping without erasing it. It did not tell me why the list going public, the proof she'd fought a year to hear, had been the thing that finally broke her resolve instead of confirming it. I have never asked her. I have had, in the 50-some years since, ample opportunity to ask her, and I have never once taken it. The first time I actually saw her again, for months after the tarmac, was not arranged by either of us directly, but by our son, Michael, who was 2 years old when I left and 4 by the time I came home, and who Margaret brought, without warning either of us beforehand as far as I could ever tell, to a Veterans Day ceremony at the base where I was stationed for medical follow-up. I was standing near the color guard in dress blues, performing the particular stillness expected of a man at that kind of ceremony, when I saw her across the small crowd, Michael's hand in hers, and the boy, recognizing nothing about me except what he'd presumably been told in advance, broke away from her and ran straight at me with the uncomplicated directness of a 4-year-old, and I knelt down and caught him, and over his shoulder, holding my own son for the first time in over 2 years, I found Margaret's eyes again, 20 feet away this time instead of 40 yards, close enough now that I could see. She was crying. The kind of crying a person does, trying very hard not to be seen doing it. I did not go to her. I stood up with Michael still in my arms and said something to him about how big he'd gotten, and when I looked again Margaret had stepped back into the crowd, and a man I now understood must be Gene, the one from the photograph, had appeared at her side with his hand resting at the small of her back, not pulling her away, just present, the way a husband is present, and the 3 of them, Margaret and Gene and Michael walking back to join them, left together a few minutes later, and I stood on that parade ground holding nothing but the space where my son had just been, and I did not say one word of what was sitting in my chest to anyone, not that day and not, in any complete way in the 53 years since. What I have never told Margaret, in all that time, in all the careful, decent, even occasionally warm conversations we have managed to have at Michael's graduations and his wedding and the births of his own children, is that I have never once blamed her, and that the absence of blame is not the same thing as the absence of grief. I performed forgiveness almost immediately and meant every part of the performance. Because the alternative, hating a woman who had fought for a year against every reasonable voice telling her to give up, felt like a betrayal of the very thing I'd loved about her in the first place. What I have never said is that some part of me, the same part that had spent 2 years before my capture quietly rehearsing my own expendability, received that wedding clipping not only as grief, but as a kind of confirmation I had never wanted and somehow always expected, that I had been right all along not to fully trust that I deserved to be waited for, and that being right about that has cost me more, in the decades since, than the missing or the camp or the dislocated shoulder that still aches before rain ever did. I have built, in the years since, a second marriage of my own, to a good woman named Carol who has never once asked me to explain a silence I still carry into rooms with me sometimes without warning, and I have been, by every honest measure, happy. None of that happiness has required Margaret to know any of what I've just described. I have simply never told her, and at this point, having let so many anniversaries and graduations and ordinary Tuesdays pass without saying it, I'm not sure the telling would do either of us any good that the not telling hasn't already quietly done instead. I still have the clipping. It traveled home with me in 1970 folded into the lining of a boot. The only thing of that kind I managed to keep through 2 transfers and a final inspection. Nobody thought to check that thoroughly. And it has lived since then in a drawer in every house I've owned. Never framed, never shown to Carol or to Michael or to anyone. Just kept. The way you keep a wound you've decided isn't actively bleeding, but isn't fully closed either. I took it out 2 years ago, at Michael's daughter's wedding, standing off to one side of a reception tent watching the bride and groom's first dance, Margaret across the room beside Jean. Both of them gray now, both of them, I noticed, glancing at me with a kind of careful warmth that has replaced whatever charge used to sit in the space between us. I didn't show anyone the clipping that night. I had simply brought it with me, folded in my jacket pocket the way I once carried it in a boot, for reasons I couldn't entirely explain to myself beyond a sense that some occasions call for carrying the whole of what you are, even the parts nobody else gets to see. At some point in the evening, crossing paths with Margaret near the edge of the dance floor, both of us briefly alone in the particular way 2 people can be alone inside a crowded room. She looked at me for a moment longer than the passing crossing required, and said, "You look happy, Frank. I'm glad." And I said the same back to her, and meant it completely, and neither of us said one word more than that. Carol found me a few minutes later near the bar, asked if I was all right, and I told her I was just thinking about how fast the years go, which was true, and not the whole of what I was thinking, and she let it sit there the way she has learned to let certain things sit with me over the years without pressing further. I have thought about that exchange with Margaret more times since than I can account for, the 2 of us standing in a tent strung with lights for our granddaughter's wedding. 50-some years past a paper handed through iron bars, both of us still, as far as I have ever been able to tell, choosing exactly what we chose that morning at the gate and on the tarmac after, which is to look directly at each other and say nothing at all about the one thing that has shaped every year between then and now. The clipping is still in my jacket pocket, the same jacket, hung now in a closet in a house Margaret has never seen. The paper gone soft as cloth at every crease from 50 years of being folded and unfolded by hands that have never quite decided whether they're done with it. I take it out sometimes, on nights when sleep isn't coming easily, and I unfold it under a lamp the way Quan unfolded it for me that first time. 3 columns wide, a torn rather than cut edge, a bride with her hair parted on the wrong side. And I read it the way you read something you have long since stopped needing new information from, not for the facts, which I have known by heart for half a century, but for the particular weight of holding it. The same dampness gone dry now, the same softness at the creases, and some nights that's enough, and I fold it back along the same lines it has always folded along, and I put it away, and I don't say anything to anyone about why.